Yeah, hi, good afternoon. It's Mike Weir, and we want to talk a little bit about the Module 1, with the reading assignments, the required reading assignments, some of the optional reading assignments, and a little bit about the discussion boards. The title of the course is Human Resources Management and Interprofessional Healthcare Teams. Uh, Way back when, in the dark ages, when I would go to school with a chalkboard and a pair of pencils and the crayons and chalk. Uh, the general idea of schooling was personnel department. We didn't call it human resources. Recently, we started calling the idea human resources, and I think that's a pretty strong idea because what we're really talking about here is the people, and the staff is a resource. Uh, and my offering is it's probably the most important resource. It's the one that's going to compose the largest part of your time to be an effective manager, is how you manage that one resource. Most of the fixed resources, the books, the desks, the computers, and all that stuff, are pretty simple because they're the same. They stay the same throughout your time there. We want to buy a new computer, we go down to the new computer shop, we look at all the computers, and we grab one. And then the computer should run, and I notice the big emphasis on should run the same way the whole time you have it. So life is good. Uh, People, not so much. People come and go. People change. People move up in jobs. So the management of those human resources, or those people that work with you, is pretty critical. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that, talking about different styles we can use in healthcare. And then at the end, we're going to have a real quick uh, one unit lecture the week of the final, which is only Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And it's going to be everything you wanted to know about human resources, but you were afraid to ask. And we'll go through some of the pitfalls and things that happen in the human resources area, and probably just have one discussion question that week because I'm sure you guys are all much better students than I ever was, but it always seems to me that the week before the final papers due, you're going to spend probably a little disproportionate amount of time on the final paper than you would have if you have started and do it every week, which we all would like to do, but we probably have lots of other conflicting things that make that happen. So the book is kind of divided up into different parts, and we're going to start about this part in team and group development. We're going to talk about uh, what we have to do as a member of an organization, and why teams increase our self-awareness. It gets us more concerned with others. It's more effective, how we become more effective in a group leaders. Uh, but I also got to tell you, from my experience, and I don't know your experience, but from a top level management thing, sometimes teams add another uh, a layer to the organization that requires some more exquisite management than maybe the traditional organization. And we'll discuss that. And it's one of the discussion board questions. I want to ask you what your thoughts are. So anyway, group chapter 1 is about groups, teams, and systems. Chapter 2 is about development, and that's where we're going to go today. And next module will be chapter 3. So we want to talk about groups. We want to talk about the idea of this open system. Talk about the difference in groups and teams. This level of systems and diversity, how it contributes. We're going to have a whole chapter on diversity, so we'll kind of fly through that here and go along. So why groups? Because we're kind of social people by nature. I mean, I'm not. I don't know if you've taken any anthropology courses. I really haven't, but I just get around a little bit, and you realize that when we get together, we're better than individuals, and we're social by nature. So you go back to the days of the caveman, where they uh, borrowed the resources of all to make the group stronger. They call it in the book the wisdom of collective. When I'm working in the business, I've always said that my two greatest successes were, one is being able to surround myself with people who were smarter than I was. And number two, I have an expression all the time that we is always smarter than me. Uh, and I think that's what it boils down to in the group. So no matter how good you are or how good you think you are, uh, proper use of a group strengthens your role as a manager, and it also strengthens the organization because there's always somebody in there who can say, and I have to tell you that several times in my career, I had the greatest idea in the world. Uh, Knock it out. It was the greatest idea of the world. And I went to my management team, or I went to the group of people I worked with, and presented this wonderful idea and expected them all to fall over in rapture that, and put me on their shoulders and carry me around the room. Well, if you see a picture of me, it would take a large group of people to carry me around the room, but that's neither here nor there. Uh, Someone in the crowd would raise their hand and say, Mike, have you thought about this? No, I didn't. Somebody else would raise their hand and say, we tried that 6 years ago and here were the problems. Okay. So what happens is that the consensus of a group, the large amount of people that can participate in a group or a team, we'll talk about that, really gives you, uh, empowers you so much more. Now, the other thing, when you're talking, you've all taken the management this and the management that course, and the more engaged and the more engaging you can make people, the more their motivation is, the more they really want to do what's good. And groups also accomplish that because you're no longer a face in the crowd. I talk about a Far Side cartoon later on in the course about I want to be me. When you're the 14th person in the 15th desk in a room of 400 people, you really don't see how you move the cog in the wheel, how the machine moves. Then you contribute to it. And if you don't feel you contribute, if you just feel you're just kind of there, it is frustrating. There's nothing that makes me or you or anybody that I know feel better than winning, a success, being a part of a successful group. Now, if I look at the hospital where I work, they have good days, bad days, and I don't get to see the whole picture. So if I have a bad day, I don't realize that the ER just uh, made their mark and hit all their requirements today. Um, so I really need a lot more direct contact, and groups help you out because that when I'm down, somebody else is up. Somebody else can kind of move into and help directly. There's a sense of responsibility in a group, a sense of teamwork in a group. Now, I give you all these wacko theories that are mine, and you can think about them and really go from there. But one of the things that I've always thought that has helped our society was Title IX, which required colleges to be equal in sports and sporting events and activities for both men and women for co-educational, co-institutional places. And I thought that was good because I thought guys always grew up on teams, baseball team, football team, rugby team, and women's sports were kind of, if they were there at all, were kind of restricted to very few people. And I think now, if you go out Saturday morning to the field wherever you live, and you see the soccer teams, you see little young men and young women, little boys, little girls. They're all participating and they're learning this whole idea of teams and teamwork. And I think that's helped people in business. Now, you may disagree with me, and that's fine. But I've always thought that the idea of more integration to men and women in sporting events or team events from an early stage has kind of changed some perspectives. That being said, I'm not by any stretch, an ex-football player or an ex, but I can even look at bands as the band as a team. The activities. So I think that collective idea is pretty simple to use, and it has so many ramifications. Communication. teams smaller. You don't have dictums coming down 5 levels. We've all played the telephone game, and um when you're a kid, where one person has a story and whispers it to the second, whispers it to the third, and by the time it gets around to 20 people, the story has no semblance of how it started. Teams usually are small enough that we don't have to worry so much about problems in communications. We can have a lot more support, a lot more direct support, and it kind of engenders that, we're all wearing the same suit, the same uniform, if not actually, at least in our brain. So, what's the difference between a group and a team? The A lot of people get really hung up on words. Um, I think in the healthcare business, the one I always love is, what are the people that come in our front door called? Are they customers? Are they patients? Are they clients? Um we Business guys have a tendency to call them customers, and I know some of our my colleagues in the healthcare delivery say no, no, they're patients. And to me, it's a kind of a not a big thing, but to other people it is. So teams and groups probably shouldn't be used interchangeably. A group, I think, as a group is a bunch of people that have a common interest. Uh, you can look at groups, like people that go to the football game together. They all tailgate together. They all um, drink beer together. They all sit in the stands and cheer and all that kind of good stuff. They share common interests. Uh, they But teams do that also. The interaction in a group is usually one or two common interests, and that common interest, like I say, may be football, and then the rest of the week they never see each other. They're off in jobs and their forms in other groups, and I think you can be both in lots of teams and lots of groups. The interaction in a group is a lot less formal. I think the interaction in a team, I like to think, is formalized. You know your position, you know where you're in. So again, back to my tailgate group. You don't show up one weekend, the world's going along. It doesn't take just everybody gets a few more hot dogs and a next extra beer. In a team, there's a little more interaction, a little more dependence on that interaction, and a little more interdependence. And I think probably that's the key to me on what makes the difference between a team and a group is that interdependence, that uh, ability to count on each other and to need each other, and everybody contributes a little piece about that. Uh, Theories. The chapter talks about that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. That gets back to my idea that we is always smarter than me. We can get lots of input. We can get lots of different places. We can move things through because we can break down some of those silos or barriers. Um, I I teach a class up here in New York and Long Island, and when I talk about silos, everybody looks at me like they don't know what it is. I worked in Kansas, and everybody was really familiar with silos, but kind of a big business term here for a while. That silos are places that are all doing the same thing, storing grain, but they're not interconnected. And so we find organizations, large organizations that don't work, are extremely siloed, and that uh, if we have groups that are just um, the same, so we have a group that's the lab, we have a group that's X-ray, we have a group that's reception, we have a group that's the business office. Uh, that's not really a team. I think team, at least to me, has a connotation of multi inputs from lots of different people. And then finally, the outputs of the team can be identified very specifically. If you all of you go into your place of work, and if it's a medical place and if it's a hospital, and you flip over your ID card, you're going to have the mission of the organization there. And that's critical and key, and we all know that. But on the other hand, it's hard to take that wonderful broad statement and reduce it down to day-to-day work. And I think one of the other things the team does is let that happen. The old joke of how to eat the elephant, one bite at a time. Well, I think teams let the organization, the mission of the organization be managed one bite at a time. I know if you've looked at or read, or probably you guys work in some of these places that use the idea of Six Sigma and quality improvement teams and lean and all that kind of good stuff. Understand again that the whole is made up of many parts, and so to try to move the whole organization at once is almost an impossible task. But to move little pieces of it is great, and then all of a sudden you find the whole organization moves in that same direction. Healthcare. If you work in healthcare, you look at this and go, "You betcha, we're open, we're nonlinear, unpredictable, self-organizing, evolving." Uh, I've worked in several different fields in my life, and everybody says the same thing. Oh, we're different than everybody else. And well, obviously, if you're working in a car dealership, you're different than a healthcare organization. You're working in a factory. You're working in the military. But so I've always kind of been, well, it's maybe not that different. And I remember way back when, sitting in graduate school, we took a course with our department chairman, and I was a senior officer in the Navy at that time, just getting ready to get out. And I had had a pretty extensive experience. I'd been in Washington, worked with Congress and congressional aides. I've worked with admirals and all this other high-ranking people. And my chairman, who was really an amazingly brilliant man, uh, kind of sensed this. I had the been there, done that attitude about me. And so he said to me, he said, "I got to tell you, Mike," he said, "that working in healthcare and working with physicians and nurses and lab techs and x-ray is going to be different than any experience you've ever had. And doctors have a certain way about them, and everybody has a role to play that's just slightly different. And the reason is because the product or the output is so different." So the cocky, smart Mike Weir said, "Oh yeah, I got that," and walked away and said, "That's not true." Well, I was at the University of Missouri, and we had a program there that after the first year, we brought back graduates. They asked graduates to come back to the university and run seminars for the graduate program and kind of say, that theory to practice. What did I learn here at Mizzou, and how did that happen to me out in the field? And I went back and found Dr. Brown, who was the chair, and said, "You know what? You're right. Healthcare is different. I learned that the hard way and the easy way and the harder way." So we have to know that first of all, we deal with patients' lives daily. I don't want to get melodramatic about it, but it's the truth. If I work at a restaurant and I screw up some hot dogs, it's just some money. If I do something wrong to a patient, it could be life threatening. Uh, the load, the cases are different. So if I worked in physicians' offices an awful lot, and you may go through 25 or 30 patients that I don't feel good, and then you have one patient who's a crisis. The intensity of the work is some days. I like to say sometimes it's 59 minutes of sheer boredom and 1 minute of like, oh my heavens, in the facility. We don't know what it's going to be. We're dealing again with people, so pretty complex. I don't think I need to labor this point a whole bunch with you guys if you work there. And if you don't, please don't be like me in graduate school and say, "Oh, yeah, I know all this." It is a different system, and it's evolving. It's constantly evolving. I've been in it about 24 years, and I look at just every phase of it. You're amazed at the technology and the increase in technology, the complexity of the payer system, the complexity of kind of the goals of the system. One thing I can guarantee you that if you don't like the way it is, sort of like the weather in wherever you live, if you don't like the way it is today, it's probably going to be different tomorrow. Uh, so I kind of look at this as a conversation. We want to inquire, exchange, process information, expand. Think you can read all the words here, but think about a good conversation you have with somebody. And I'm not talking, we always have to say, "How's the weather?" How about those Yankees? I'm thinking about a conversation where you're trying to reach a goal. The skills that you use one on one. For the married folks, it's very obvious how this works. Um but for the people that haven't been and don't maybe quite have the same appreciation, but the idea of hearing what the person says, listening, exchanging information, negotiating, where can you give your most, where can you give your least, that all is pretty much day to day in healthcare. We have to make a lot of decisions. I think back to economics, and I guess the best definition of economics I ever heard was it's economics deals with the allocation of scarce resources. And if we had all we wanted, uh, wouldn't be hard. I often say, making a decision is hard because if it wasn't, it wouldn't be a decision. So if you come up to me and said, I'll make dinner for you for the rest of the month, or I'll make you go out in the garden and dig dirt for the rest of the month. Oh, make me dinner. That's not a decision. It's pretty obvious. So we have to make decisions in healthcare. We have competing um, uh, interests in a hospital. We have the administrative burden. We have the clinical burden. We have the ancillary burden. We have the people. All those things. There's not one path. If there is, we wouldn't have jobs. You wouldn't have to go to school. You wouldn't have to study. You just go in, and it'd be obvious as the nose on your face. So that's one of the issues that we have. Uh, Microsystems in healthcare teams, units, departments. Um, we see teams a lot more in there. Microsystems, how we decide those is what's their purpose, who's composed by them, what links them together, patients, professionals, processes. Um, how does this really make the team happen? What makes the team happen? What is the purpose of the team? Um, you know, you you want to get very specific. I think when you start talking about, we in the military used to talk about strategy and tactics. It really's gotten co-opted now, and you see it in business all the time. You strategic decisions, tactical decisions. I guess the way I can explain it best is that when General Eisenhower, uh, who was Supreme Allied Commander during the World War II, wanted to invade Europe, he wrote a directive that was about 3 lines, and it basically said, commence planning to invade Europe in the spring of 1944. Bang, that was it. So that was the strategy. We were going to invade Europe in the spring of 1944. Then that great strategy got broke down into tactics and purposes. And so the Air Force or the Army Air Corps had to figure out what they were going to do. The Navy had to figure, the Brits, the Americans. I mean, the complexity of the invasion of uh, D-Day in Normandy was like unbelievable. One of the biggest operations ever completed in the world ever. And it all started with 3 sentences. So when we talk about microsystems, we're talking about changing of that a system that we have down to individual links. So anyway, I'm sorry there was a little transition there. I just got off the phone with my son, and he and my daughter-in-law are heading to the hospital for my first grandbaby. So uh, that's important. So we're going to talk about the healthcare system. It's volatile, unpredictable, complex, ambiguous. If you guys work there, you know what I mean. Uh, it's always changing, uh, and we don't know what's going to happen. We're very hard to predict. Um, and complexity. Wow, we go from things like keeping the front desk squared away to doing amazing surgeries in the place. We have people that are doing fairly menial labor tasks to some of the smartest people in the country. So we have an amazing system, and in fact, one of the things I always get blamed for is I question whether the fact there is a healthcare system uh, in the large sense. A system has some connotation of relationships and interdependence, as we talked about earlier. And if you think about the healthcare system that people talk about with the big H and the big S, we find that there is no system. The employers, it's the triad we've talked about, the milking stool, whatever you want to call it, the iron triangle of healthcare. You have the providers, you have the customers or the patients, and then you have the third party payers. And all three of them are very much looking after what they want. Should be a system, should all work for the same goals, but unfortunately, we find in most cases that doesn't happen. So, what we're going to talk about in the rest of this course is this idea of institutionalized relationship building. We're going to force feed the organization into building these ideas of relationships. And we do that pretty effectively with teams. We find statistically in some of the readings, we'll talk about that the idea of a team is increases engagement. And when we're engaged, our morale's up. We feel that we're part of the solution, not part of the problem. Uh, Again, there's studies that prove this, but just think for yourself. When you know that people count on you, you usually do a better job. 90% of us. Now, we all have that person who, what do they call it, social loafing in a team, that they kind of stick in the corner. I remember when I went to graduate school, um, there was three of us in a team and we were doing fairly well, and the one of the faculty members put this person in the team who was a not very motivated and or part of smart. And so whenever we would give an assignment, three of us worked at full-time jobs in addition to going to school. So we had that ability, we all had that ability to budget our time and to make things happen. This young gentleman was a student, and that's all he was. And I think he thought beer and pizza were the only reason he was going to graduate school. So we would get out on a project and we'd give assignments and we'd come back to gather the assignments, and he never had one done. So we cut him out fairly fast. And you're going to find that every so often. But in general, you're going to find people in teams have that, people in groups, people in a relationship-based organization have some feeling of dependency on others. Quality improvement, retention rates, clinical outcomes all seem to uh, cluster around this idea. And I think at least one of the ideas is that engagement, that piece that we're involved in. The levels of change in an open system: individual, interpersonal, group, organizational, and community. So again, as we talked about, um, it all starts with the individual level. It all starts with the change in you. And then the change in smaller groups, and then groups, organizations, and communities. Uh, if you try to turn an organization around from the top, it's going to be very good. It's hard. It's like pushing a rope. You have to do it by a pole. You have to have everybody coming around. So it's it, groups seem to make that happen much more effectively than the traditional organization. If you look at the way hospitals and healthcare organizations and other groups have been arranged with that top down machinery where all the decisions came from the top, you find it doesn't work. I like to think of those organizations like when my son, who is now going to be a dad himself, was a little baby. We bought him a toy, and it was a bunch of gears, and you could move the gears around, and the top gear was a big gear, and had maybe 85 teeth to it. And then as each level, as you move down and fit the gears in, the gears got smaller and smaller and smaller till you got to the bottom. And what happened is when the gear in the top just moved a quarter turn, at that got multiplied in every level of the gearing, and the one in the bottom was going at about 45, 50 revolutions from a quarter turn up top. And traditional organizations lead to that. Uh, in the Navy, we were that way for the longest time. So someone would come by and say, "Oh, wow, that looks pretty bad. Maybe we should get that painted sometime." And by the time it got down to the lowest guy on the ship, it was, "This has to be painted within the next 5 minutes or we're going to take away your birthday." So traditional organizations don't have a dampening effect that teams do. Changes in open systems. Again, as we change the system, we change it piece by piece. We eat the elephant one bite at a time. The individual systems intervention are in focus, behavior, perception, emotion. Good. You again know this. It becomes pretty simple, but the focus, goals, and methods in an organization become kind of self generating. If you go into a group of people and everybody's like, "Oh, the place stinks. I hate it," then you have a hard time saying, "Wow, this is a wonderful place." They're looking at you like Little Mary Sunshine. So what we want to do is look at how systems change these individual. So focus, we do relationships and communications between two people. The goal is we clarify that nature. That relationship becomes cast in concrete. We all know it. And then how we go about as the managers doing this is, I think, both a skill and an art. Now we can teach, and we will teach all the different tools in different courses you've had. You know, the power of walking away, bargaining, all the different ways that we can lead into getting people to move our way, power. But so we can teach the methods, and we can teach them pretty well. But it always comes down to you. What are you going to use? Is a concession better than power? Trying to power over something? Is offering an alternative or a bargain, saying, "If you do this, then we'll do this." Is that better than walking away from the deal? So that we talk about interventions, we talk about interpersonal interventions, and we can go through the shopping list of them. But oftentimes it depends on how you do it. Now, we've all had leaders who were really nice people, and if you got them outside of work, they were great. But sometimes in work they made the wrong decision on how to get the group moving ahead. Sometimes they were not strong enough. Sometimes they were not did not focus on goals. Sometimes they were selfish and focused on themselves. So while they know the tools, using them is the skill. So we'll kind of work and talk a little bit, hopefully in our discussions, talk a little bit those skills. So this is the idea of intervention, goals, tasks, and roles. Well, what we do with the organization and the system intervention. What's the culture of the organization? Now, I don't know how many of you worked in different places. Uh, Unfortunately or unfortunately, the Navy got to move about every 2.5 years. And I was on several different ships. And some of the ships I were on were just so successful, and others not so much. And we used to say in the military that the Navy was a system conceived by geniuses for execution by idiots. And meaning that the plan was there and all you had to do was follow the plan. Well, why was there leaders and why was there groups that were better than others? One was leadership and one was the culture of the group. I think success breeds success. I think people who want to do well and do well continue to you get to like it. I think we identify what behaviors and goals were acceptable in the successful organizations, and in the unsuccessful organizations, not so much. One of the things I've always felt is if you walk by something that's wrong and don't change it, then what you've really done is lowered your standards. And everybody who sees you knows that. So I'm the administrator. I was the administrator. When I walked down the hall and saw a piece of paper, I'd pick it up. Not so much because, I'm like the paper picker upper, but I think that sends a signal to the whole organization that if I can do it, everybody can do it. Leadership by example, leading by example is important. How many leaders do we know that would get up in front of the group and say, well, here's what we got to do, and it's not what I want to do, but the boss says we have to do it. When I find that in a manager, my first blush is to make them not a manager, but I calm down, get my Irish and let it calm down. But what you're really doing is saying, I don't have any opinion and I'm not really backing this. It's somebody else's idea, so what the heck? Uh, you as a leader and as a manager, in which you're all aspiring to be or are now, have that obligation to back the organization, to be proactive, the culture, the leadership, the goals, how we make that happen. And then we get down into the methods. Um, and I think if there's anywhere that I see um, I've had lots of problems. You may be in organizations that are successful, but I see lots of problems with the idea of training and cultural change, development, executive development. I think we get in a job and we kind of, well, it's always been done this way and we want to do it that way. It's always been done. I think that large organizations have that inertia or lack of inertia where they just kind of keep rolling along. I think one of the other positive things in groups is a little group can make a change. Uh, the I worked at a place one time, and my boss always used to say, "We have to be agile, mobile, and hostile." Agile, mobile, and hostile. I think the hostile I could drop off with, but we have to be agile. And if you look at that whole management system you studied on agile management, and we have to be mobile, and we have to be able to move, and we can have to make change. And to make change, we have to be smart about it. So all those things kind of fit in. So that's kind of some of my thoughts on the first chapter. And we're going to slide into the second chapter here, which is a little shorter, and hope. Okay, sliding into chapter two, we want to talk about small group behavior. We want to talk about the idea of the components of this group life, developmental stages, group behavior, and such. Um, the I versus we perspective. So we're talking about the I versus we perspective again. I took a break here for dinner. Anyway, what we a lot of these things we assume, and as we move forth in the rest of this lecture, we'll talk. When I was preparing for it, I got this great uh, epiphany of all the groups I've been in, and I keep thinking, yeah, I remember this, or this situation struck me, and I versus we is one. Uh, you all remember the thing, I guess, that there's no I in team, and what we're really looking to do is move the individual and make the individual become almost subservient to the group. We want the group to become like one, and that's always our goal. We have this group think. Now, great idea and great issue, but one of the problems about groupthink is sometimes we start not having the ability to think outside the group. I don't know how many of you, we called it, I sometimes hear it called target fixation. It came from dive bombers in World War II. They would practice dive bombing, and the plane would get up in the air and then turn over and dive right at the target. And at the last minute, pull the ripcord. The bomb would continue. All you physics majors out there, the bomb would continue in inertia, and the plane would pull away. And so it was very critical, the speed of the target. It was very accurate bombing, but it was risky because you were flying all the way in. So they were training people out in Arizona to do this. And what they found out is that the pilots had tremendous safety problems in crashing. And what happened is they became so fixed on the target and getting the bomb off that they didn't see the land around them coming up. And so by the time they got to the optimum target they've kind of lost all perspective of the big picture. And sometimes that can happen in this we perspective in groups. You always kind of need somebody in the group that says, that's kind of like the acid test, that kind of looks at it again and says, geez, is this the right thing to do? Um, is there another way to do it? Uh, Especially in the early stages of group planning. So that's a consideration. The we thing is good, but we has to be composed of lots of little I's. I guess is the best way to put it. Um, the next thing we'll talk about is some of the characteristics that research has shown on group one: the social brain, collective resonance, and collective folly. Uh, we find this idea that the social brain is that people start identifying with each other. They have patterns of development that move with the group over time, and people again start thinking like the group. Uh, if it's positive, that's a good thing. But if it's negative, it really becomes an interaction pattern that doesn't make things work well. Uh, Back to the whole idea we talked about at target fixation. Everybody falls so in love with the process that they kind of lose that individuality of making their own decision. And as the research in the book talks about, that neuroscience supports this notion of social brain. That the more you're together, the more you start thinking alike and looking alike. There's some other parts of like that is, and I don't know if you ever heard of a thing called Stockholm syndrome. Stockholm syndrome, it derives from a group of people who were kidnapped in Stockholm in Sweden, and they lived again, they're kind of mellow, a little more mellow over there, and so they decided they were going to wait the kidnappers out. And after a period of time, the people that were kidnapped started to associate and develop characteristics of the kidnappers. And when it came time to get them out, they were like associated with the kidnappers. I don't know if you remember or have ever heard about Patty Hearst, who was kidnapped by the Symbian Liberation Army. And she was a socialite in California and was kidnapped by this pretty radical organization at the time. And by the time she had spent 6 months with them, they had pictures of Patty robbing a bank with the rest of the group. And that actually, again, was a sort of a social brain. She was so used to the group, and it was a very negative connotation, but she became part of that group and lost her individuality completely. The other thing we want to talk about is the idea of collective resonance. And that was talked about by Levy here, and he says that you feel this sense of energy, rhythm, intellectual knowledge when you're with a group that kind of usually is a very positive thing. And it means we all kind of feel that we're on the right track. I don't know how you guys are, but I know sometimes I'll be sitting there and I'll be thinking, oh, I want to go get a pizza tonight. But I'm just thinking it in my brain, and I say to my wife, well, what do you want to do tonight, hon? And she says, oh, let's go get a pizza. And I'm like, wow. Uh, an example of collective resonance, that we both kind of think the same thing based now how that decision was made, if we were working all day or we're tired or something like that. But you find in a group that they make great progress towards these common human goals when they have that feeling of like the collective resonance, like we're going to support each other, and our feelings echo off each other. Kind of the opposite of this in some ways is the idea of collective folly, and that the group can really become tremendously dysfunctional, especially in a negative way. I think a quote in the book I really liked on page 17. It says, collective folly. The focus of the group is on barriers that divide and polarize, and the group rather than the connections that unify it. So what happens is we start worrying so much about our differences and focusing on our differences, we never look to things that bring us together. I don't want to get really tremendously political in here, but that's an accusation that's made right now about our government, is that we have become such uh, uh, ideas and focusing on our philosophy, whether it be conservative or liberal, is the only good one. And so we never look to develop some sort of consensus. So in groups, collective folly can be tremendously damaging. So uh, there's a good chart on table 2.1 that talks about these behaviors, both of a group and the environment, and how people behave in the group, how much time do they spend together, uh, who are the talkers and who are the listeners. Um, as you go through reading this lesson, and I think again all of you have been in groups. Hopefully there'll be lots of flashes or nightmares, whichever the case may be, of groups you've been in where you found these things. You know, there's a group where one person decides that they are the smartest person in the group, and they start talking, and they never stop talking. And there's other people that have great ideas, but they're kind of sitting in the corner. There's an awful lot of other social studies about groups that we don't get into, but I've read, and it's sort of like there was a whole big series of where you sit in a meeting. It gave an absolute clue of how you fit into the group and where you were. Do you sit at the table, or do you sit at the row of chairs behind the table? People sit at the table feel they're movers and shakers. People that sit in the row behind don't want to be called on and don't want to participate. So we want to look at those kind of things. And the chart talks about them. What is their valiance? Who talks to who? Uh, Again, think about groups you're in, and people. What are some of the things that makes people talk to each other? One is they're from the same place. So if there's three people in scrubs, chances are they'll be talking to each other. If there's a couple people from the business office or registration, because they identify. Uh, Men seem to talk to men sometimes, women to women. Ethnic groups kind of gather together sometimes, especially initially in the group. So what we really have to do is look at these cultural, ethic, age, gender, profession that might impact the group, and look at how to combine them better. And we'll talk about that later on in this course when we talk about diversity. So let's talk about some stages of group development now. We'll talk about the member, the group, and the environment. So we talk about the idea of the member, and how that member fits in the group, where their influence is, what stresses on the member. First, their behavior, their personalized feelings, how they feel about things. We all come into a group carrying some luggage, uh, and that luggage is our feelings, our norms, beliefs, and values, and our concept of ourselves. Uh, when you look around as a member of a group, and we're just talking about members now, we're not even going to talk about leaders. Um, we're going to look at when people come in, and we're going to start in this part and then moving on, talk about how these things are reflected. But when we look at the groups, the unconscious life of a group, we have kind of the work group, and we have the unconscious aspects of the group. Well, obviously, the work group is rational. It tries to complete the tasks. It tries to do what's happening. But the basic assumption group has like an unconscious aspect of the group, and sometimes we perceive these members that as kind of interfering with the real work of the group. So uh, oftentimes you look at someone who's not participating, or you look at someone who is over participating, and you identify them right away as, oh, we got to get rid of them, when in fact a real group kind of molds and strengthens those people along the way. What we talk about, there's basically three things you can do. We have a dependency first, and we start with the fight or flight, and then we end up with pairing. Uh, and then after all those three things are completed, we end up with kind of a good work group. Um, the book in chapter 19 has a chart in this, so we can kind of follow along. Dependency is, and boy, do I when I was reading these, I see these a lot, and I'm sure you do in groups too. People come in the group and they're kind of blown away by everybody's in the group. Uh, there's three doctors there, so gee, I'm only a medical assistant on the floor, so I can't talk to in front of the doctors. So the member kind of feels like they know nothing, very childlike, very like afraid, kind of sits in the corner. Uh, we find the leader in these groups really becomes omnipotent and really has to carry the ball, and it becomes very much a leader decision because no one else kind of speaks up. We talk about the idea as the group matures a little bit. So the dependency stage is pretty much like the beginning of a relationship. Uh, we were all very nice. You'll find they talk later on in the book about, and we'll cover that, about at the beginning. There's about very little work done. It's all social interaction. So people talk about the weather, about the sports, about their kids, about where they work, and nobody gets onto the job actually of what the group's supposed to do. And at the beginning, it's a very bland, very proper discussion in this first phase, this dependency phase, and usually you have a strong leader that's trying to push the group ahead. The next phase becomes fight or flight, and what that really does is leads to a portion where you start the group. The honeymoon's over, so now you know everybody. You've been to a couple meetings, and you go, oh, "That person's a jerk," or "I don't like this," or "I'm not sure with that." So two things happen. You either try to get out of the job, try to get away from the group and say, I'm done with this. I have better things to do with my time than sit around here. And I know you've all heard that if you've been in a group or maybe even felt that yourself. Or you pick fights with people. You think you're starting to feel uh, you want to balance your group identity and your personal identity. And so if the group is going one way and personally you're going another, that dichotomy that you have in there leads you to either run or engage. So here it's a bad time to be the leader because they kind of lose their omnipotence. So at the beginning, you think the leader was, hung the moon. And in this group now, the leader and the draft of it, everything becomes stupid. Everything becomes attackable. And so this is a difficult time for the leader because they really have a hard time in balancing both the individual and the group obligations. Um, so sometimes we'll argue, and then the other piece of that thing in this fight or flight stage is we quit talking about the problems completely. We don't want to solve the problems, so we talk about all kinds of other neat things that are happening. Uh, the next kind of phase is the pairing, and that becomes hope and optimism. We start moving the group into understanding group dynamics. We pair people up. We get people that act small sub teams that kind of carry the water forth. Two or three people in a small group, and they work out these unconscious group dilemmas that we talked about, and then finally a work group. So we find this whole process interesting, and it grows as we talk about it. So here I got banged up on my slides here, but the work group focuses on the tasks, and the assumption group is the anxieties, polarities, and here and you can read that. The next one I always love is Tuckerman, who talks about a group informing, storming, norming, performing, and we added one in here, adjourning. I have been members of groups that met every Tuesday at 9 o'clock, and I don't know whether originally we got some things done, but after that we never got things done because we just kind of existed forever. When you study group and group dynamics, which we'll continue to do, we didn't have a proper tasking. Um, in fact, the one I can think of is we were in the quality improvement group, and I was a member, and we would meet in the mornings. And the great thing was somebody would bring donuts, and that was one of the big things. And who's going to bring the donuts for the next meeting? But we were in charge of quality improvement in the healthcare system. Now this is an old, and today these meetings in the Six Sigma and Agile and all those other kind of things have taken over a lot better. But this is back in the dark ages of the TQM, Total Quality Management. And we'd sit there and we'd just kind of talk about things, and then next meeting talk about other things. You all know, I think it's my experience, and I'm sure it's yours. There's certain key things no matter when you get together in a group. One is having an agenda, and two is having minutes. Um, they're hard to get somebody, you have to bribe somebody to do them. But both of these things are essential anytime you meet together as a group, and especially, I think, minutes. Um, Agendas kind of have a make the meeting start, finish, and end, uh, and it kind of does away with a lot of um, opportunity to have one of these 3 and 4 hour meetings. I worked in a physician practice one time, and the chairman of the group had Wednesday afternoons off. So he started scheduling a lunch meeting on Wednesday so that we could, as the management team, could kind of review the week and plan for the next week, week and a half. And it started out lunch. So we met at 12, and we would be done 1 o'clock, 12:30, and we'd have an agenda and we'd take minutes. And it got so that, bless his heart, bless his little heart, as we say in the South, bless his little heart, he loved the sound of his own voice. So the meeting started going till 1:30, 2:30, 3, and it turned out the meeting was going from lunchtime till 4 o'clock, and he would kind of go home. It was a very interesting meeting because we would, I was an assistant administrator then, but myself and the CFO would sit there and we would chart the meeting, and we would chart the position that the doctor originally came in with. And many times, by the time the meeting ended, he would completely have reversed what he was doing. We never kept minutes, so we would just wander over the same problems. So uh, there's lots of rules to groups and group meetings. We'll talk about the idea of forming. Uh, that's when, and this kind of ties in with the next stage, identifying the stages of group development. We start the group, and the book talks about it. It's interesting, the numbers they use, because really I agree in concept, and it was funny for me to see these numbers. They say that in the early stages of team development, you only spend about 50% of the time on the work related issue. You spend some time on uh, developing the rules for the group and dependency of the group and pairing. And but there's not a lot of conflict in the forming stage. Again, it's the honeymoon. You're trying to be nice to everybody. You're trying to sit back. What's Abraham Lincoln's famous saying? I think it's Lincoln. And it's funny when you make a quote, you can either say it's Lincoln, the Bible, or Shakespeare. But it's I'm pretty sure this is Lincoln. He says, I'm better to be silent and have people think you're a fool than open your mouth and confirm all suspicions. So there's an awful lot of people in the forming stage that just kind of sit back and kind of wait for things to go. Uh, so we spend little time. So the idea in this first stage, this forming stage, is to get that sense of belonging, get those beginnings of a group. The next stage comes up to the storming stage, and what happens in storming is now everybody knows everybody, and we don't have to be nice anymore. We don't have to be. We kind of lose that team player attitude that we first came in. That's something special about being in the group. And in the storming stage, we find, according to the study in the book here, that flight statements increase. People say, "I'm done with this. I've been to the meetings. Nothing exciting is happening. I'm going." People conflict more. They say about 30% of the meeting is delving into conflicts. And again, we're not getting a lot of work done. The storming stage is one where, as a leader, you have to really watch. I can remember I was in a practice one time, and we were forming up a group from existing practices that were in the neighborhood, and so we had about 30 physicians that signed up to join this group practice, and most of them were 1 or 2 physician offices, and so we went along and we had meetings and the forming meetings, and we were establishing who we were. Now, if you deal, and I mean this in the most loving sort of way, but physicians are not shrinking violets. So even in the forming stage, we had lots of people um, engaging, and but they still were very polite. Uh, so we came to the storming stage, and one of the physicians in particular would have each meeting with what he wanted, and he would threaten. So he would say, "If we don't get this, I can't stay in this group." And he was a primary care physician, and had a pretty good practice that the specialists kind of needed or were looking forward to. And about the third group meeting we had, where he gets up and threatens, the chairman, who was an oncologist, looked at him and said, "Well, then, goodbye." And it was a very quiet moment in the group, and he got up and left, stormed out. And so I talked to the chairman afterwards, and I said, "Oh, we're losing." He said, "He'll be back." He said that he's just kind of testing the group out. So as a leader in this storming phase, you have to really be on your guard. What is critical enough to make someone go leave the group that will affect it, and what's kind of posturing in the whole thing. We get to the norming phase, and this is where you start reaching consensus, and you learn to give and take. In good groups, at least, you learn to give and take. Um, the whole idea in here is your communications develop, your goals become more established and more fixed. Um, the group members accept the group, and they understand that everybody's a little different, and they understand that that's how we can make it work. And the leader now becomes uh, more of a facilitator than a leader, because everybody in the group now really rises to the purpose of who they are. Um, and then finally, we come to the performing stage, which is the last piece, or the work or productivity stage. About 60-70% of the work the in the work productivity stage is working, and it it's where you make your money. And then finally, we come to the adjourning stage. There's very few groups, I think, that need to be the same group all the time. Now, when you look at if you had an org management course and you talk about that, they talk about tasking, group tasking, SMART goals, and all those kind of good things. So, and the different people you need for a group. So if your charter is to do one thing, you need a certain cadre of people in the group. If your charter is to changes, well, then you have to reform the group. And when you reform the group and bring new people in, you kind of go through these stages again. So what you really want to do in everything is have a beginning, middle, and end. And when you have the end, you define what your goals are. Again, using a military example, that we have to define what victory is. One of the problems in Vietnam was we never really defined what victory was, and we didn't know whether we won or lost. I think if you looked in Desert Storm 1, the goal was, when we moved all the Iraqis out of Kuwait, then we've done. And we did that, and we stopped. So when you're in a group, you have to do the same thing. You say, what is success? What is our goal? What are we looking for? So we talked about defensive counter dependency and conflict, trust, and structure, work productivity. Uh, Group productivity, size. This was always an interesting one to me when I read the studies, because I kind of intuitively knew it, that the smaller the group, probably the better it is. There's a maximum size of about 8 or 9 people. I've been in groups that, we went around the table 2 times and had horse holders in the seats along the wall. Not getting much happening. So the people that are actually the action people should be around the 8 or 9 size. Now, if you want to drag assistants and other people to make presentations, but they shouldn't be normally part of the group. The group should be smaller, and you find when you have more people, and they talk about which I think is interesting. I always heard the term social loathing, but I found out it was started in the 19th century. If you have a large group and you're not dependent upon, there's an awful lot of people that just ride the wave, and that doesn't get things done. Uh, also, so we talk about the 3 to 8 members. How long does it take for this group to age? From the start to finish, the authors here say it's about 6 months for the group to kind of get into the performing stage. I kind of laugh because I taught a course on Six Sigma, and the Six Sigma doctrine is that no group should last more than 6 months. So I guess they're going to accomplish all their actions in a stormy environment. But anyway, that's kind of the gist of the and some thoughts I have on the first 2 chapters. Let me get my wow discussion board questions. Again, try to think outside. Try to move more than just answer the question. There's a supplementary reading about improvement in healthcare by groups, and you can kind of use that as a springboard. And again, you can do some research on your own. But why does or does not a group contribute to improved healthcare delivery? And I think that's a good question. And then the discussion posting 2. When we move to this idea groups, it's kind of counter to the traditional wire diagram, with the president and the vice presidents and the directors and the managers and so that long chain of command. Now, obviously, that started back in the Industrial Revolution and has provided a long history, but is it really fit for the new workplace that we're in, and especially the new healthcare workplace? And those are kind of 2 of the questions I'd like to chew around. Done for this. What I'd like you to do, please, is if you have questions, you have comments, you don't understand something, give me a buzz or drop me an email. Thanks a bunch, and we'll talk later.